All right, it's been a very long wait for thousands of matriculants, but the release of the Matric results could be a time of anxiety and depression. So some students very excited, but we know that some are fearing the worst. Some are even considering doing the worst. How do you deal with this anxiety? I'm joined in studio now by Bradley Daniels, clinical psychologist. Great to have you with us, Bradley.
Good evening.
So for those who don't understand all the fuss, just try and explain how serious this seems for some of those learners.
Well, I think we have to start at the beginning rather than just sort of catch in this moment now. Pre-exams, that's when the stress started. And then after exams, that's sort of like when suddenly this big load was off all the learners' shoulders. And then there was this long wait between the festive period. So we have a lot of anxiety and stress accumulating over a period of time. So that now that we're on
You're up at night thinking about it.
Up at night thinking about it, and now we're sort of on the eve of it, and so it can become really stressful for individuals. And so I think it's important that we're aware that learners will know how to deal with any sort of disappointment, perhaps. And remember, disappointment does not only mean I perhaps didn't make the grade. It also means I perhaps didn't get the 90% that I was looking for. So it's about managing that disappointment. But I think to just take it back a step, I think it's important to say that people who are at risk for suicide do not become at risk for suicide suddenly because of Matric results. There would have been something beforehand, so we would have had to look at sort of mental health beforehand. And I think too often we jump to the sort of almost a very reactionary kind of approach, where at this time of the year we start thinking about it, whereas we should be talking about mental health ongoing throughout the learner's development.
There are some students who are probably thinking, if I don't pass, maybe I'll think of suicide. How high is that risk in South Africa?
Well, I couldn't tell you the figures right now, where that sort of would be accurate in terms of looking at sort of the actual research. But let's just say the risk may exist. So we obviously have to obviate sort of for that risk, or we have to sort of make sure that we have some sort of arrangement to sort of make that risk as low as possible. And I think the message to learners particularly, and families, because remember, it's not only the learners that are doing Matric, it's also the whole family, is that we have to kind of like realize that this is just a form of an assessment. It's not the end of the world. This is one part of a milestone assessment. And whatever the result is, there will always be different avenues with regards to what can be done. So provided if a student has gotten the grade that they needed to pursue whether it's university career or whatever course they're wanting to pursue, then that should put them in good stead. So it wouldn't really matter if you got a 99% versus you got a distinction. You would still be able to follow the course that you were planning to do.
So you put life in perspective, basically.
Put life in perspective, and so that's a good way of putting it. So almost what I like to say is to remind people to be mindful, to stay mindful. So in the practice of mindfulness, we talk about it's the practice of staying in the here and now without judgment. So whatever the result is what the result's going to be. Nobody can go back to sort of like change, what you wrote, in November 2018. But what we know we can do is look at whatever the result is, and we can make plans around what the result is.
Let's play. I mean, we got quite a hectic call from somebody earlier. We're going to bring that up, and she was just saying she's terrified. And I mean, that build-up can begin. I remember from Standard 9, you start thinking, everything is going to be determined by my Matric results, and it all starts sort of 2 years in preparation. So there's a huge build-up.
There is a huge build-up. And I think the build-up, it's almost, it's almost like when you're about to watch a scary movie, and sort of everyone tells you how scary it is. So, your anticipation builds. And obviously we all have different types of personality makeups. So fundamentally what that would mean is a person that's already anxiously wired will be more anxious than somebody who is less anxious. But remember also, again, let's just take it back to the bottom line, which says, let's keep things in perspective. So let's realize that this is just one form of an assessment. Yes, it determines a lot of your journey going forward, but it's not the end of the road. So there will always be options with regards to what can be done. So we're always very phobic or concerned about results in sort of the mathematics, sciences, and technology. And I think those are important, but those are also often ones that cause a bit of a debacle. As we just heard from the IEB and the education department with regards to the mathematics sort of marks, which this year were needed to be shifted down. So I think it's important that the perspective is held, and that families and parents and guardians should also reinforce for learners that this is not the only option for them. So I'm not even saying that people should start thinking about, if I wanted to study medicine and I didn't get in this year, maybe I should do veterinary science. That's perhaps that's a very compromising kind of way of the past that people used to think about. I think what I would recommend now is that we start saying, okay, so I didn't get quite the grade to get into medicine. How about if I volunteer in hospital for that year or until I can improve my mathematics grade? And I think that lateral thinking will also enable those particular learners to be able to get practical experience before moving on to what they thought was a disappointment.
Yeah. I think we have another sad voice note. Let's just listen from one of the learners who've dialed into our WhatsApp line.
Hi, this is Renele. About matric results. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. I can't sleep. I'm so scared. I can't eat. I'm stressed. But I know I've passed my matric. I know that, but I'm very scared. I'm very, very scared.
What would you say to her?
It would be difficult to sort of dispense, and I would be very cautious to dispense advice on the basis of a voice note, because there's no real context. But I think what she is expressing, she's expressing feelings of feeling sad and feeling worried. Now, I wouldn't be able to say contextually, whether that's out of context or whether it's in context for that particular individual. But I think the teachable moment here is to basically say to the nation, to basically say that we need to be more present as families. So today is not the day to come out and say matric results. The ask is that people were involved throughout the longer process, and so not even in the sort of grade 12 year, from grade 10 onwards or throughout the high school career, we should start inculcating a culture, not just with the families, but I think also from the education department, and I think also just from society as a whole, that we start taking our learners through a process rather than to an endpoint, and then we expect them to sort of perform one or other miracle of sorts. But there hasn't been a supportive build-up through that process, and that's what we're asking for.
So it seems to me like often the worst scenario for learners is that they will actually fail and they'll have to do matric again, and there's shame in that. So you mean as a society we've let there be too much shame in that?
I think as a society we have, but I think shame is the number one thing that sort of impinges human beings from improvement. So that's the thing that stops us from understanding that, listen, this is just an assessment. And so this is why I kept repeating the word around not matric exams, it's an assessment. So it's just an assessment. It's giving you feedback.
One of many in your life.
One of many in your life. And some of them won't be as finite as an exam. Some of them will be around, how well do you manage your career? Right? Even once you've become a dentist or a doctor or psychologist for that matter, it's about how well can you manage your career? How well can you manage your career while life happens around you? So this is just a small step for learners in terms of what kind of real life is starting to feel like.
And you say families should be involved, but I mean, tell us about the pressures for some poor learners, say. So you kind of have that guilt because your parents have put you through school. Maybe it's huge sacrifice. There's this expectation. You may even go to varsity. You must do better than them. It's huge.
I think intergenerational pressure, is almost a universal. But if we really put the social imagination and we really put the discursive lens on, so you should remember that today is the Independent Examinations Board. So fundamentally, children that would have been able to get to those schools in general would be slightly more of a higher socioeconomic class than kids who are sort of doing some of the broad spectrum public schools, if you want. So the thing that we're looking at is we're looking at what support, so from a psychosocial perspective, what support are we actually giving to the educational system as an institution? So for the learners in the IEB schools, very often they will have a psychologist on board. They may have other sort of people of the multidisciplinary team that's supporting them to realize their best potential. That may not be the case for public schools. It may certainly not be the case for public schools in rural areas, perhaps. And there's no real support. And I think the best we can do is to offer mediated support. And that's where the family would be the most important part of mediating the support. And so as I said, to go back, the intergenerational pressure is a global thing. It doesn't only happen in South Africa. But perhaps the slant to take is with our history and with the history of inequality in society. And the reality, if we look at the sociology of education, the fact that inequality is replicated in the education system. And so that means that we can have different resources at different levels in the socioeconomic strata. And so this will yield different results for different learners. And notwithstanding that we have many talented learners that do not come from fortunate backgrounds, that perhaps through their own ability manage to get perhaps a scholarship, or to manage to get, or maybe their parents made really huge sacrifices to be able to get them through, for example, a private school, or even just a high school for some. That's the reality of our country. And so the main thing we have to actually also say is to congratulate all the learners for getting to this point. So I think that's the first point at which we should have started, is to congratulate all the learners, because to get to this milestone has already taken work. And what they do forward, that sort of would be, you know, sort of dependent on how they decide to pursue it. But up until this point already, there should be a congratulations, and there should also certainly be some sort of affirmation for these learners. So that is probably something that needs to be done by all parents, all guardians, even schools. I think schools still have the tradition where learners would come and fetch their results. And I think that's a teachable moment again right there, to just acknowledge, to affirm. And I think if we look at educators as part of the multidisciplinary team, that can give collateral to psychologists as well. That's where educators need to be able to say, hey, listen, I'm a bit concerned about this learner. Or they would see the results and know this student of mine is going to be very disappointed by this result, even if it means a difference between a distinction and a high B. So those learners, the invitation is for those educators to still stay on guard, to still stay sort of tuned in and switched on, to be able to say, listen, we need to check these particular learners, or we need to make this plan, or we need to put in place this plan. Say, listen, your mathematics result is not that great, and like you didn't do well, but you know what, this is a plan for a rewrite. It's as early as Jan, and perhaps if it's as early as Jan, or whenever the case may be, perhaps there's an alternative to what you had planned, which will still put you on the same path.
You spoke about this country. I heard a story the other day, a situation where a child had received 3 lessons over the year and then still had to write exams. So that's setting up whole classes for failure, and there's no support at that school. Maybe let's end with sort of practical advice for parents out there who are just stressed, worried about their children.
So practical advice for parents. So and we see this sort of with sort of newborn babies and parents. If the parents are anxious, the children will be anxious. Yeah. So that doesn't stop as we get older. So it's important that parents also manage their own anxiety and their own expectations and their own fears, and manage to keep them separate from what's happening for their children, right? And then the things to kind of repeat to your kids is say that it's going to be okay. I mean, this is a phrase I like saying in practice. It's okay, because it is okay, and everything that needs to happen after that point can happen. So it's definitely not an end path. Like, the story doesn't end, the lights don't go out at that point. But I think at this point it's also really important to perhaps let learners know sometimes, and also families. So where, for example, learners are feeling suicidal, where there is that kind of threat, we should definitely make sure that we sort of post, for example, the South African Depression and Anxiety Support Group, and relevant kind of crisis lines that people could call. So that definitely is a way of ensuring the safety. But I think for the parents is just to stay present without overshadowing, because very often we're talking about a small percentage of learners that will have huge mental health crisis around this. A big portion of the learners are going to realize as soon as they get the results and they've passed and they can get into university or wherever they want to go, it sort of just ends. But I think maybe if we want to be proactive, let's even talk about the celebrations thereafter. Because that's when people kind of lose their, reasoning sometimes, and
because they've only thought of the
until
exams
then,
and not beyond. We have to leave it there, but thank you. Good advice. I remember thinking this counts for everything. Years later, you suddenly see it. It's just a little part of life. So take that advice. It's going to be okay. This isn't an end point. This doesn't determine everything. That was Bradley Daniels, clinical psychologist, and we'll see if we can bring up those numbers for SADAG and other lobby groups a little bit later in the show.